Story number 1. They say some trails remember your name and call you back with voices you thought long buried. And I wasn't lost when I stepped off the marked path. I was chosen. Her lullaby wasn't sung with kindness. It was a trap disguised as comfort. I followed a sound I couldn't locate, but it knew exactly where I was. I've spent 15 years in the wild. Nothing prepared me for what followed me out. I've spent most of my life in the woods, guided hikers, led rescue operations, even camped through snowstorms without flinching. These mountains raised me, but I realize now I only ever walked their surface. I never looked into their soul until the day something looked back. I began that morning like any other, boots laced, pack loaded, a light mist rising off the forest floor. I didn't need maps. The trail near the dome was muscle memory, but I came to scout routes for an upcoming tour. What I found was a melody. It started so gently, like the wind had learned to sing. Faint, but unmistakable. A woman's voice humming a tune I hadn't heard since childhood. It stopped me in my tracks, not from fear, but longing. I couldn't explain it. That voice knew me, knew the ache in my chest I hadn't named in decades. I followed it, not like a fool chasing fairies, but like someone being guided home. The Cherokee called her Asgaya Gigagai, the whistling spirit who sang lost souls into the darkness. Hikers along the Appalachian Trail have reported hearing a woman's voice drifting through the trees, always beautiful, always haunting, and always leading them away from safety. I knew that story and thought it was legend, but standing there, with my compass spinning and GPS blinking out like it had swallowed its own coordinates, I knew better. The trails shifted beneath my feet. Landmarks bled into one another. Stone arches from trails I hadn't touched in years now sat where they didn't belong. Deer paths curved like serpents to welcome my steps. I walked for hours. The melody deepened, layered with soft words that felt like lullabies but carried the weight of grief. She sang like she'd once been a mother, now hollow, aching, feeding off the lost. Then the song changed. Its edges sharpened. Her sweetness replaced with urgency. Then hunger. That's when I realized I wasn't just being lured, I was being hunted. The voice grew stronger as evening approached, transforming from wordless humming into a crystal-clear soprano that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to backtrack, but the forest wouldn't let me. Trees closed behind me like theater curtains. My flashlight flickered, and then it showed something that made my spine lock. Mirrors, dozens, hanging from branches, framed in rot and dust, reflecting my terrified face from every impossible angle. My breath caught. One reflection blinked out of sync. I took one step back, and that's when I heard her. The voice stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the trees. But I wasn't alone in that silence.
A breath, not mine, close, just behind my left ear.
I spun. My headlamp caught the faintest movement, something pale slipping behind an ancient oak. I rushed toward it, thinking I'd confront whatever game was being played. What I found chilled me more than any ghost story. Footprints, human-shaped, but wrong, too long, too thin, and where there should have been toes, there were claws, like something had borrowed our shape, but hadn't studied the anatomy well enough.
I ran. I didn't choose to. It was primal. Bolted through the underbrush, thorns tearing at my pants but leaving no marks on my skin. Something was guiding me, and it wasn't the trail. It was instinct and fear.
The voice returned, only now it mocked me. The singing resumed behind her, but now it carried notes of amusement, as if her terror was exactly what the voice had been waiting for. I caught glimpses again of that thing, not fully human, too tall. Its limbs swayed without joints, like shadow puppets hanging on invisible strings.
And yet, I kept hearing something else, my mother's voice.
She'd died when I was 7, but she was speaking to me, comforting me, asking about my regrets, whispering things no one else knew. I checked my recorder later. I had spoken back, full conversations, like I believed she was there. The recording captured Sarah having detailed conversations with the whistling woman, discussing childhood memories she had never shared with anyone. I finally stumbled into dawn, found my truck, have no memory of the last 3 miles. My boots were shredded. Camera filled with photos I didn't take of my face, reflected in those cursed mirrors. The rangers didn't believe me at first, but they found the footprints. Perfect circle around the oak, fresh in dry earth. No mirrors, no deer trail.
But I'm not the only one.
In the 2 years since, 17 hikers have reported hearing her. 3 were found off trail, claiming they followed a voice promising to take them home. The Cherokee elders were not surprised. According to tradition, she was once human. A woman who died searching for her children. Her love turned to hunger. But she's not alone. There are other things in those woods, taller than men, whiter than bone. They crawl, watch, study, not beasts, but something worse. Trail cameras positioned at known encounter sites have captured footage of the creatures, positioning themselves for optimal observation. They prepare the forest before hikers arrive. They anticipate us, guide us, rearrange the world around us like set pieces. The deeper truth is this: they're learning. The psychological impact on witnesses is consistent and severe. Every person who has had extended contact with the pale crawlers reports the same recurring nightmare. Tunnels that don't appear on maps, chambers scraped by claws, gear arranged methodically, like someone wanted to understand how we use it.
Not animals.
Observers, researchers, predators.
There's no randomness to it.
The pale crawlers represent something far more threatening than a simple cryptid sighting. They want to know how we think, how we run, how we trust voices we love, even when they lead us into shadows.
We're not victims,
We're subjects. Each hiker that walks their forest adds to their data. Each scream is a data point. Each moment of confusion, fear, surrender, it's studied.
I left the Appalachians, moved west, but the dreams followed.
And sometimes I still hear her, a voice humming in the wind, telling me she misses me, telling me I was her favorite. But this isn't just about a ghost woman.
This is about what's behind her, what's using her.
The Pale Watchers are still out there, and they're not done with us yet. They say those who survive don't talk, but I am not afraid of the Watchers anymore. I'm afraid of what they're building. After I moved west, I swore off the forest, but something followed me. It wasn't the woman's voice. It was something deeper. The feeling that I was still being watched, not by eyes, but by intention. Like I had been filed into a folder, and someone kept checking it. The dreams never stopped. I walked down endless corridors made of soil. There's no sky, just breathing walls that tighten every time I think of leaving. I hear my own footsteps ahead of me, my own voice calling out to myself, and something crawling upside down just behind me, always almost touching. I started documenting everything, every nightmare, every flicker in the mirror. I thought I was going crazy until others started contacting me. A woman from Maine sent me a voice clip. Same song, same melody, but her version, it ended with a whisper. A whisper that said her name. A hiker in Utah swore he saw pale figures the night before entering a canyon. They stood on ridgelines, unmoving, always in perfect triangulation, like they were coordinating a study. He blacked out. When he came to, his map was rearranged, trails mislabeled, markers moved. We compared photos. The mirrors had returned. One hiker from Oregon told me the worst part wasn't the creature. It was realizing he had begun humming the song without knowing, for days, as if he had been implanted with it.
That's when I knew. The Pale Watchers weren't just observers anymore.
They were teachers, or worse, engineers. They were refining their tools, and we were part of the prototype. The final piece came when I reviewed the audio again from my encounter. For weeks I thought I was talking to my mother's voice.
But when I ran a frequency analysis, I saw something horrifying.
A second voice layered underneath. It's faint, glitchy, non-human, not even female. It was using my mother's tone like a skin, but beneath it, something was correcting the pitch, adjusting the emotion, almost rehearsing. What if that's what they were doing? Not haunting us, but training to be us. Copying cadence and memorizing how we express grief, joy, guilt. The watchers weren't collecting data for fun. They were developing a model.
Of us.
2 months ago, I received a package with no return address. Inside were 3 items: a shard of glass wrapped in moss, a burned-out emergency beacon with my old coordinates scratched into the back, and a handwritten note: "We're almost ready."
I don't know what they mean, but I know what's coming.
We used to believe they watched us like prey. Now I believe they watch us like teachers study students before graduation. And graduation is near. I've returned to the Appalachian Trail, not because I want to, but because I need to see what's changed.
I don't plan on coming back, but if I do, and if my voice sounds different.
Don't listen. Story number 2. They don't scream, they don't chase, they study hard.
It wasn't the eyes that terrified me. It was how they moved, deliberate, like they'd done this before.
I used to believe silence in the woods meant peace. Now I know it means they're near. Something followed me for 3 nights straight, but only left footprints on the 4th.
I wasn't the first hiker it mimicked, but I might be the first one to come back.
The woods never felt threatening to me. I'd walked miles upon miles alone through tangled roots, unseen creatures, and the layered breathing of the forest canopy. I was a soloist in the wilderness until something else joined the song. That year, I took my usual pilgrimage to a lesser-known trail that splintered off from the Appalachian corridor. I had a new thermal camera, some notes to collect, and no expectation of anything unusual. They call them the pale crawlers, humanoid figures that navigate the forest floor on all 4s with an unnatural grace that defies human anatomy. Unlike the folklore creatures of local legend, these entities have been documented by trail cameras, witnessed by dozens of hikers, and studied by researchers who refuse to publicly discuss their findings. I'd heard whispers online, forums filled with blurry images, garbled night audio, and threads that always ended with admins locking them down. It all felt like internet theater, until I saw the first one. I was camped alone near a collapsed firewatch station, a site far from official maps. My camera caught a figure crouched beneath the skeletal remains of a pine tree, unmoving for nearly an hour. It was only after midnight that it began to shift. Not walk, not crawl. It glided across the terrain like it was made of something boneless. Rodriguez was awakened not by sound. The creature moved without disturbing even the dried leaves beneath it, but by an overwhelming sense of being watched. He described it as a pressure against his consciousness, as if something was examining not just his physical presence, but his thoughts and intentions.
That's exactly what I felt.
I wasn't dreaming when I opened my eyes. I could see a silhouette at the edge of my camp, tall, low to the ground, limbs bent backward. I didn't move, not because I was frozen with fear, but because I sensed movement might encourage it. Then it tilted its head, not like a dog, like a puppeteer testing limits of a jointed toy. One leg folded under, then extended again, not forward, outward. Its skin was pale to the point of translucency, revealing dark veins beneath the surface, like a road map of corruption. Its eyes reflected his flashlight beam with an inner luminescence that reminded him of deep-sea creatures adapted to perpetual darkness.
And it mirrored me.
When I exhaled, it seemed to pause. When I leaned slightly left to see it more clearly, it did the same. A perfect delay of 1 second, my own distorted reflection played back through a predator's interest, or I fled into my tent, not bravely, just slowly, like you would step away from a sleeping tiger. For hours, I lay in silence. My thermal camera later revealed something that made my blood chill. The creature never left. It circled it crept. It stayed exactly beyond the visible ring of firelight, spiraling closer each time, not randomly, but systematically. The creature spent extended periods at locations where he had walked, crouched low to the ground as if memorizing his presence through smell and touch. It licked the bark where my hand had leaned. It tapped its elongated fingers on stones I had sat on. It wasn't tracking, it was learning. When I left the next morning, it didn't follow, but every step of that hike out felt like someone else's footfall was being laid on top of mine, perfectly aligned, shadowed just a second behind. Just a second.
I wasn't the only one.
Weeks later, I tracked down a cryptozoologist named Dr. Margaret Chen, her contact buried deep in an encrypted blog that vanished days after I messaged her. She didn't respond in words, and she sent files. Photos of rearranged campsites, thermal footage from across 3 states, GPS overlays of sightings matching missing hiker routes. According to Chen's research, the creatures exhibit territorial behavior that spans multiple states along the Appalachian corridor. They appear to maintain hunting grounds with defined boundaries marked by scratches on trees and arrangements of stones that form geometric patterns. She believed they weren't just scavenging or hunting, they were developing profiles, classifying humans by scent, behavior, decision-making under stress, building something, some database, not in machines, in minds. One recording she shared showed a crawler dragging a hiking boot into a cave, sniffing it, then mimicking the act of lacing it. No explanation, just understanding. Some hikers have discovered their backpacks repacked with items arranged in order of apparent importance, as if the creatures were trying to understand the hierarchy of human survival needs. I tried to warn others. Rangers smiled politely, then ghosted me. Fellow hikers told stories that mirrored mine, then stopped replying after saying the dreams started out. Every person who has had extended contact with the pale crawlers reports the same recurring nightmare, being pursued through endless underground tunnels by something that moves within human speed while perfectly mimicking their own movements. In those tunnels, the echoes aren't yours. The final proof came not from me, but from a stranger on the trail. She left a note pinned to a tree, wrapped in plastic. If you find this and you're human, well, they already know you're here. Don't walk in circles. Don't light your fire the same way twice. Never, ever teach them anything new, and they represent an intelligence that predates our understanding of these mountains, something that has been waiting in the shadows for us to venture deep enough into their domain to become subjects of their endless patient curiosity.
I haven't gone back since, but I know they're still watching. And worse, they're still learning.
After months of silence, I received a brown envelope. No return address. Inside was a hand-drawn map with coordinates etched in faded pencil and one sentence: "You stopped too early." I debated for days. Then one evening, I packed a smaller kit, turned off all tracking on my phone, and followed the map deep into a region that didn't show up on any current topographic data, a patch of woods that even rangers referred to as uncharted reserve. The entrance wasn't marked, just a crumbled limestone outcrop with a jagged crack no wider than my shoulders. My flashlight flickered against smooth stone, too smooth to be natural. I descended. Within minutes, I realized the legends weren't exaggerating. The tunnels were narrow, winding like intestines, yet somehow consistent in width and height, as if designed. There were scratch marks on the walls, not random, but patterns, mathematical in symmetry. Geometric spirals carved repeatedly, deliberately. And then I found the chamber. It wasn't large, but it was clean. No debris, just a central slab of stone with bones arranged in concentric circles around it. Some animal, some not. One still had a boot on. I backed out, trembling.
Then I heard movement, but not behind me, beneath.
The stone slab rose half an inch, shifted slightly to the left, and slid open. What came out didn't move like a crawler, Don. Moved like multiple crawlers, stitched into one, its limbs interwoven, disconnected, reforming itself every few seconds. A biological algorithm in motion.
It didn't chase me.
It just watched and opened one of its arms, revealing inside a wrapped object. A camera. My camera. the one I left behind months ago. I wasn't the only one drawn to the tunnels. There's a group. Call them explorers. Call them madmen. I found them through encrypted channels. The Hollow Trail Society. They believe the crawlers are not just studying us, they're replicating, not cloning, not imitating, something stranger. A woman named Maria, ex-military and tracking specialist, reached out to me after I posted thermal photos to a DeepNet server. She told me she'd found signs of crawler-built enclosures, not dens, but structures partially above ground. I joined her on one expedition, deep in the Carolina backcountry. She showed me a series of tree formations that weren't natural, branches bent into loops, bark stripped in Morse-like patterns. In the center of this configuration, a hiker's backpack, untouched by animals, contents reorganized by category, electronics on one side, food grouped by calorie density, journals stacked and marked with symbols that weren't part of any language. She called it field testing, said the crawlers were filtering human logic through instinct or...
But it was what we found 2 miles north that cemented my horror.
A makeshift mirror, constructed from salvaged metal shards, propped up against a mound of clay. The reflection wasn't of us. It was of 2 elongated figures standing where we should have been, moving slightly out of sync, like a delay in reality. When we turned around, the clearing was empty.
I can't prove it, but I know what I saw.
They're evolving, not just biologically, but socially, hierarchically, systematically. The crawlers aren't just lone predators, they have structure. I believe what Dr. Chen hinted at but never published. They're practicing civilization. In the deepest tunnels, Mireia and I discovered a space that resembled a classroom, or maybe a simulation room. Dozens of scratched-out diagrams covered the stone walls, rudimentary human postures, tool silhouettes, even abstracted faces.
But they're teaching each other not just how to move like us, but how to think like us.
When I fled for the last time, I dropped one of my notebooks, the one with annotated behavioral patterns, time logs, scent theories. A month later, I got it back in the mail, no sender, but inside, a page had been added, my own sketches, corrected.
The hand that drew them wasn't mine.
Story number 3. You think you understand time until you walk into a forest where it watches you back. I recorded myself hiking, and the footage shows me splitting into 3 versions, each moving a different way. My camera captured photos I never took, one of them showing me asleep beneath bare trees, in what looked like winter, even though it was summer. I entered the grove once, but my gear recorded me entering twice, at the same time.
The worst part? I wasn't alone in the video. Someone else was holding the camera, and they were me.
They warned me not to trust my watch in those woods. What they didn't say was, don't trust your memories either. I was a physicist, chasing relativity. That's all I wanted. A clean set of measurements on how time is supposed to be constant, flowing forward at an unchanging pace that governs every aspect of our existence. It wasn't superstition that led me to the Appalachian Trail, and it was science, cold, precise, and logical. I had positioned atomic clocks at 5 points along a section of trail near Shenandoah National Park, hoping to validate known theories. These devices are accurate to within 1 second every 15 billion years, making them perfect instruments for detecting even the smallest temporal variations. The goal was simple: hike between them, log the readings, confirm the expected dilation from elevation. The first anomaly occurred at mile marker 47, where a dense grove of ancient oak trees creates a natural cathedral of interwoven branches. That's where everything cracked. The trees seemed impossibly old, the air thick like syrup. I checked my GPS, 2:15 p. Precisely when I entered the grove, I paused, took notes, snapped photos. It felt like 10 minutes, just 10. But when I reached the next marker, every clock I carried told the same story. 3 hours and 47 minutes covering the 2m distance between markers. My mind refused it. My body felt rested, no fatigue. And then there were the photos. Photos I never took. One showed me standing under golden leaves, Another under bare, brittle branches like the dead of winter. Same trees, same angles, different seasons. Some shots were taken from behind me, like someone else was holding the camera, someone with my hands. I stared at one image of me walking, head tilted back, eyes closed, as if in a trance, and I had no memory of that moment. And yet, there it was. Documented. I returned the next day with heavier equipment and a mind teetering between logic and dread. The digital voice recorder was set to loop. I placed motion-activated cameras through the grove. I wanted evidence. Either I was losing my mind, or time itself was splintering. The motion sensors recorded Vasquez entering the grove at 2:15 p.m., exactly as her timepieces indicated. Then came the impossibility. Footage showed me walking one path north, and another version heading south at the same time. 3 different versions of myself captured simultaneously, moving through the same space but never interacting. The timestamps were accurate, and no glitches, like no overlapping files, and then I played the audio. It started normal, me narrating environmental conditions, but under my voice was me again, and not an echo, not interference. It was my voice. But the words were wrong, talking about equipment I hadn't brought, referring to things that hadn't happened. Then came the part I've never played publicly. I asked a question on the recorder, but then my voice responded, casually, as if answering someone else, but only my voice was audible. The response didn't match anything I had said before or after. Well, it felt rehearsed, preordained. I sounded calm, confident, too confident. I looked around me, felt the air buzz behind my teeth. Then it happened, and across the clearing, I saw me, the version from yesterday, examining the same twisted oak I was standing by now. Her hands reached for the bark just as mine did. We moved together, shadows of each other, separated by exactly 24 hours, both versions existing simultaneously in the same space, but separated by the thin membrane of 24 hours.
I stumbled back, threw up, tried to blink it away, but she didn't disappear. She just faded.
And then the center clock rang negative. The atomic clocks positioned throughout the research area recorded data that violated the known laws of physics. 2 clocks were stable, 3 drifted. But the one at the grove's heart didn't drift, it reversed. 17 minutes of negative time. I hadn't just observed time misbehaving, I had stepped into a pocket where time ran backward, spiraled, and folded in on itself. Soon, other scientists joined. Dr. Chen from Duke had been tracking similar anomalies for 5 years. He'd mapped them, thin fractures running from Georgia to Maine. They weren't random, they moved with lunar cycles and fault lines. The incidents occur most frequently during specific lunar phases and concentrate in areas where the trail crosses fault lines, underground water systems, or locations with unusual magnetic properties. And they were growing. These anomalies weren't hiccups in reality. They were metastasizing wounds. Areas that once spanned 30 feet now consumed miles of trail. More hikers disappeared, and those who returned, they weren't whole. I interviewed survivors. One man had lived 5 days in the woods. When we found him, only 40 minutes had passed in real time. He aged visibly. His beard grew. His hands shook. Another woman remembered hiking in autumn and emerging into early spring, her clothes still dusty with fall leaves. They described feeling disconnected from linear time, experiencing memories of events that haven't happened yet, and suffering from a condition Chen terms temporal vertigo. The worst story, a family of 4, gone without a trace in Maine. Their campsite was warm, food half-cooked, fire still alive, but they were never found. For 3 weeks, rescuers heard them
Calling.
Their voices moved through the forest, echoing across canyons, but every time searchers moved toward the sound, it shifted, just out of reach. Search teams have reported finding evidence of missing hikers, fresh footprints, abandoned gear, even voices calling for help, but no physical presence. One ranger swears he saw the father. He ran toward him, and the man vanished mid-stride, like a candle snuffed by an unseen breath. The most recent data horrified me. The clocks now catch distortion daily. Some clocks read time in fragments, minutes that overlap, hours that split, locations where multiple time streams exist simultaneously, creating pockets of reality where past, present and future overlap in impossible ways. Hikers step in and vanish. Some return with journals filled with writing in their own hand, recording events they never lived. I've seen my own notes, pages describing encounters I haven't had yet, dialogues with people I don't know. One message was scribbled in the margins. You already survived this one. Don't forget how. Son.
But I don't remember surviving anything.
Maybe we've worn down the walls, too many feet treading ancient paths, too many hikers crossing timelines like thin bridges, and now reality is fraying. What makes the time slips truly terrifying isn't just the lost hours or displaced memories, it's the growing evidence that time moves differently in these mountains. I still go back, the clocks demand tending. And part of me is still in there. Literally, somewhere in that grove, another version of me still walks those leaves, looping endlessly through a day that refuses to end.
And I wonder,
which of us is the echo? Weeks passed, but I wasn't done. I kept returning to the grove, not out of duty anymore, out of obsession. I needed to understand why I'd seen myself, why I kept dreaming of days that hadn't happened, and why, sometimes, I'd wake up with soil under my fingernails and no memory of where I'd been. I planted deeper sensors beneath the grove, soil samplers, magnetic field monitors, even low-frequency resonance detectors. What they revealed was impossible. There was a second version of the grove beneath the one we walked through, a mirror layer of energy and light embedded below the roots, existing out of sync with our time. It pulsed irregularly, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, like an echo trying to become a voice. And I began to hear things in my tent at night, my voice, whispering equations I hadn't solved yet. Time isn't broken, it said. It's looping. The scariest part? I started writing those equations in my sleep, in symbols I didn't recognize but understood. One evening, I followed a deer deeper into the grove. It darted between trees that had never been there before. Black bark, silver leaves. Suddenly, the GPS blanked. No signal. The trees around me shifted, their roots moving as if to form paths. Paths I didn't recognize. One led downhill, the other, steeper, into fog.
I took the uphill route, not out of logic, out of instinct.
Halfway through, I looked behind me. The trail was gone, so was the deer. Instead, I saw people, half-formed, as if drawn with fading ink. A child with no face, a woman wearing my jacket, an old man staring back at me with eyes I couldn't forget, because they were mine. They said nothing, I just watched. Then the forest shimmered, and I was alone again. Back at camp, I reviewed the footage, frame by frame. There was no deer, but in one shot, the camera captured me, staring directly into the lens from behind the camera, even though I was the one holding it. That version of me looked older, his eyes, tired, like he'd been wandering longer than I could imagine.
I asked Chen about it. He didn't even flinch.
You're not the first to meet your future self. The trick is not becoming him. That night, I dreamed again of fire pits, tents, and voices calling from inside tree trunks, my voice among them. I woke with moss on my boots and footage of me, asleep, being watched by someone. Frame 2120 revealed their face.
It was mine. Vasquez is gone. Disappeared 3 weeks ago. Her last message to me was short. Don't trust the clocks anymore. They're not measuring time. They're measuring us.
Her base station remains untouched, but her main clock, it now reads -82 minutes, constantly ticking down, never resetting. I checked the backup logs. Every time someone disappears into the anomaly, the count increases. Every reappearance, it ticks up. It's not measuring seconds anymore. It's tallying versions, splits, losses, lives folded over. There are more of us than we think, some trapped, some wandering, some watching. And now I stand at the grove's edge again. The trail behind me leads back to certainty. Papers, labs, silence. But the trail ahead, it flickers, and I hear them again. Me, laughing, crying, pleading. The air hums, vibrating like a plucked string. If I step forward now, I might never return. But if I walk away, another version of me will. That's how the anomaly balances. One in, one out. I write this so that someone, maybe another me, will know. Time isn't linear here, so it's a corridor, and every door you open leads not just forward, but sideways into yourself.
So if I vanish?
Don't come looking. Just listen. We're still in here. Story number 4. They didn't touch me, they didn't speak, but they moved with me, every single step, like a silent mirror, flickering just at the boundary where my eyes couldn't quite follow. I went out there to lose myself, and instead, I found something that already knew exactly where I was going. They were always in the pictures, always at the edge, standing still, but never the same number twice. They weren't hiding. They were rehearsing. It took me 2 days to stop thinking I was imagining them. It took only one video to confirm they were real and organized. They weren't haunting the forest. They were monitoring it, and they wanted something from me. I just didn't know what. Not yet.
I never planned to tell anyone this story. When I first returned from that solo hike through the Appalachian wilderness, I told people I'd simply had a weird week. But the footage on my camera, the dreams that followed and the things I saw just outside my peripheral vision, they haven't left me alone since. I need to say this out loud, even if no one believes me.
It began on a trail in North Georgia, and after my divorce. I wanted isolation, not the kind people chase on crowded beaches or in yoga retreats. I craved silence, the raw, unforgiving kind you only find in deep wilderness. I'm a trauma counselor. I know the science behind healing in solitude. I just didn't expect the forest to stare back. At first, it was just a feeling that, you know when you're being watched? Well, it's primal. On the second day, during a break at Neil's Gap, I took a series of photos for my journal. When I reviewed them, I noticed tall, vertical smudges in the tree line. They weren't branches, they weren't tricks of light. They were consistent and upright. I squinted into the forest and saw nothing. But the camera had captured something. Someone, dark silhouettes, wrong in proportion, thin, elongated, watching. I rationalized the images at first, lens flare, camera issues. But as I moved deeper into the trail, they kept appearing. Every single image, always at the edge, never centered, always oriented toward me. That's when the paranoia settled in. I began taking photos not for beauty, but for surveillance. I used the lens to confirm what I couldn't see directly. It wasn't imagination. The shadow figures moved with me. They mirrored my pace. When I stopped, they paused. When I turned back unexpectedly, nothing was there. But the camera never lied. I left the lens running while I ate lunch. A 47-minute video. I didn't expect to catch much. But that recording, it changed everything. I watched them communicate, not with sound, but with movement. One figure would shift, and others would adjust in perfect sync. They weren't random, they weren't wandering spirits, they were organized.
They weren't alone, and I was no longer alone either.
By the third day, their behavior changed. They began anticipating me, not just reacting to movement, but predicting it. They moved before I moved. They knew my route, my thoughts, my decisions. I changed direction abruptly once, just to test them. Still, they were there, already realigning themselves into new observation points. Some blocked diverging trails, the others stood like pillars between gaps in trees, guiding me back toward the main path. And it wasn't just spatial manipulation. I started hearing things, not noises, thoughts that didn't belong to me. Echoes that weren't mine, in my dreams. I wandered through infinite corridors of trees, while their eyes burning through bark and fog. I could never see them clearly, but I knew they were discussing me. evaluating me. I tried to leave the trail. Just once. Curiosity got the better of me, but every time I attempted to deviate, even a few meters off path, the activity escalated. The camera caught frantic repositioning, figures blocking gaps, forcing me back, and then came the malfunction. My GPS device began feeding me paths that didn't exist. My compass spun like a child's toy. I stopped trusting technology. I relied on instinct, but the watchers knew that too. They had studied me long enough. Eventually, the trail began guiding me to a valley that wasn't on any map, a place the sun barely touched. Every tree leaned inward like nature itself was trying to warn me. At the forest's mouth, they stood, dozens of them. I didn't take a photo. I didn't need to. They were visible now without the camera. They were no longer hiding. They were waiting.
I ran.
I don't remember how far. Only that the trees blurred. The air grew thin. The watchers didn't chase. They didn't need to. Their presence clung to my shadow, mirrored every breath I exhaled. Eventually, I found a road, a passing truck, civilization, but I didn't feel safe. Not really, because they let me leave. I didn't escape. I was dismissed. My final photograph, taken just before I stepped out of the tree line, showed them clearly. Lined at the edge of the forest, perfect formation. Not angry, not hostile, disappointed. They'd been preparing, studying, and I failed whatever test they had in mind. A month later, I contacted a paranormal researcher I found online, Dr. Patricia Williams. She had collected hundreds of case files, all eerily similar. Same forest, same silhouettes, same escalation. Her theory? Quartz-rich geological formations act like psychic beacons, pulling through entities that exist in electromagnetic fractures of our dimension. The Appalachian Trail, riddled with these deposits, becomes a corridor, a laboratory, and where the subjects' missing persons cases spike where sightings occur. The more intense the shadow presence, the higher the likelihood of disappearance. It's not random, it's a harvesting process. Observation, manipulation, selection. I told myself I wouldn't go public, that no one would believe me, but I've seen the footage, I've lived the manipulation. They weren't trying to kill me, they were trying to understand me. Every step you take out there is a data point. Every emotion you feel, every instinct you ignore, every decision you make, they collect it, they refine it. They're building something far more terrifying than a haunting. They're building a profile, not of a person, but of a species. 3 weeks after returning from the trail, a brown envelope appeared on my doorstep. No return address. Inside, a USB drive. Just one folder. Dozens of files, all named with dates and coordinates, each corresponding to disappearances along the Appalachian Trail. They weren't news clippings, they were field reports, surveillance logs, annotated trail maps, photos that mirrored my own, captured from angles I never took. Some of the photos were of me. One video file, marked RT, Phase Escalation, showed footage from behind a tree, me sitting, eating, checking my camera. Then it zoomed slowly, deliberately. Film this. Someone or something else did. In that moment, I realized the shadow people weren't just studying hikers. They had their own means of recording, of filing, of comparing outcomes. I reached out to Patricia Williams again. She didn't answer, not by email, not by phone. A week later, her faculty page at Appalachian State was taken down, vanished, no forwarding contact, just a 404. But I wasn't done searching. Using old Reddit archives and paranormal forums, I found her sister, who reluctantly confirmed Patricia had disappeared during a solo field trip near Roan Mountain, left behind only a journal, one entry scribbled repeatedly.
They are rehearsing something, a pattern. It's almost done.
I followed the coordinates she last logged. What I found there wasn't forest anymore. It was a clearing, perfectly circular, burned, scorched rock and spiral patterns etched into the ground with quartz shards pointing inward like a compass made by something alien. Through encrypted forums, I connected with others who'd seen them, survivors. There weren't many, but all our stories matched. Julian, a botanist from Maine, saw the shadow people mark trees with claw-like symbols before he was lost for 2 days without memory. Kira, a wildlife photographer, found bones arranged in spiral formations, some human. And Daniel, an ex-hiker turned recluse, claimed the shadows showed him a rehearsal where he was forced to march alongside them in silence for hours in some between place that wasn't day or night. They all had dreams, nightmares of the same valley, same dark figures, same feeling that something's about to begin. Something has changed. In the last 2 months, dozens of sightings have been reported not just on trails, but inside towns, at the edges of schoolyards, gas station parking lots, apartment rooftops. Photos flood online, get pulled within hours, but I've saved them. The figures are no longer just shadows. They have depth now, volume. Some even seem to carry tools.
Not weapons, instruments though, survey equipment, geometry, angles.
They're constructing something, people, but not in our dimension, not yet. Dr. Williams believed their true goal wasn't abduction, it was transposition. She theorized the shadow people are precursors, advanced observers for a dimensional migration, not invaders, transplanters. Our world is being tested for overlap compatibility. Each hiker is a variable, every dream, every emotional reaction, data fed into a model to determine stress tolerance and resistance. The formations in the forest, the navigation interference, it's all part of a template being calibrated. I think they're mapping us, preparing a perfect mirrored infrastructure in a dimension just adjacent to ours.
And once it's ready?
They'll bring something through. Last night, I took one final photo.
I wasn't in the woods.
I was standing on my apartment balcony. No trees, no fog. But when I zoomed into the frame, into the shadows between 2 downtown buildings, I saw them, at least 6, facing directly toward my window, arranged in perfect formation. And just like always, they were already watching before I knew to look. Story number 5. Some mountains don't just rise from the earth, they remember who dares to touch them. You won't hear footsteps behind you. You'll hear your own voice, calling from somewhere you never walked. They say the rocks at Klingman's Dome rearrange themselves for every intruder. What they don't say is why. I once met a hiker who had been missing for 3 weeks, except he swore he'd only been gone for 10 minutes. There are maps the Cherokee never shared with the outside world, for good reason. I saw why. I've been working with the Park Service for 14 years. That's long enough to know which stories rangers laugh off and which they refuse to touch. Every park has its haunted trail, its vanishing hiker tale, its campfire whispers. But when every Cherokee elder I met spoke about certain peaks in the Smokies with cold silence, I stopped laughing. Long before the Appalachian Trail existed as a recreational pathway, the Cherokee Nation understood that certain peaks in these ancient mountains were forbidden territory. They called them Envy as Gaia, the places where spirits dwell. These weren't poetic warnings or cultural metaphors. They were protocols for avoiding spiritual contamination, passed down like recipes, specific plants to burn, symbols to carve, paths never to step on. Joseph Crow Feather was the one who took me seriously. He wasn't a shaman. He dressed in worn hiking boots and flannel and carried a laminated binder with tribal records. He said his great-grandfather had been one of the last trained in the full ceremonial knowledge before white schools replaced Cherokee learning. Samuel Crow Feather had kept hand-drawn maps of peaks never to be touched. Most of them aligned disturbingly well with places where modern hikers had vanished without a trace. "Do you want to understand what's out there?" Joseph had asked.
I want to know why people don't come back, I replied.
He didn't answer right away. He just handed me a translated account from the 1940s. That was the first time I read about Klingman's Dome and the hunting party of 1847. The most extensively documented forbidden peak lies along what is now the Appalachian Trail in the Great Smoky Mountains, where Klingman's dome rises above the surrounding forest like a massive burial mound. What Joseph told me didn't read like a ghost story. It felt more like a field report. A Cherokee hunting party of 12 experienced warriors entered the Kingman's Dome area during the autumn of 1847, despite knowing the traditional prohibitions, because severe winter weather had driven game animals to higher elevations, and the tribal community faced starvation. They thought they could handle it. They couldn't. On the fourth day, they discovered that the landscape around Klingman's Dome had changed overnight. Familiar valleys had disappeared, replaced by deep ravines that hadn't existed the previous evening. Rock formations they had used as navigation landmarks were found in different locations, arranged in geometric patterns that suggested intelligent manipulation rather than natural geological processes. These weren't dreams. These weren't visions. These were men trained to track elk in snow by reading the bend of a blade of grass. And they had no explanation for why their own trail markers had been rearranged into messages written in an unknown symbolic language. What they encountered next pushes against everything we believe about time, space, and perception. The hunting party encountered what Samuel's account describes as moving mountains, rock formations that shifted position when not directly observed, creating an ever-changing maze that made navigation impossible. That was the moment I stopped reading it as legends. Sequoia Bell, the leader of the party, believed the Nightland beings were testing them, that courage and ritual would be enough. He performed purification ceremonies and led them deeper into the dome's heart. But courage wasn't the currency those beings dealt in. 3 members of the hunting party disappeared during the second night on the Forbidden Peak. Their sleeping furs were found neatly arranged around a cold fire pit with no evidence of struggle or departure. Most disturbing was the discovery of their footprints leading directly into solid rock faces, as if the mountain had opened to receive them and then sealed itself seamlessly. I felt nauseous when I read that line, because 3 weeks prior, I'd helped search for a missing hiker on Klingman's Dome. We found his pack and boots arranged around a cold fire pit. His footprints led into a boulder. I never filed that detail. The last 6 hunters only escaped because Sequoia performed a ritual that involved burning specific plants while reciting protective chants. Joseph said it wasn't about overpowering the entities. It's about asking, he explained. They don't respond to defiance, only acknowledgement. But even the survivors paid a price. They aged rapidly over the following months, developing white hair and deep wrinkles that made them appear decades older than their actual ages. Some began to speak about events that hadn't happened yet. Others couldn't remember their own families. I cross-checked Joseph's maps against modern incident reports of 17 peaks, 17 forbidden places, each one with missing persons reports that matched Cherokee descriptions of Nightland being interventions, no signs of struggle, gear arranged intentionally, navigation equipment failing. I interviewed a woman who swore she hiked the same 2-mile trail loop for 8 hours and never once returned to the same clearing. A man said his GPS showed he was walking northeast, while his compass showed south. His drone footage later confirmed he'd been walking in circles. One survivor saw his own face in a creek and watched it smile back before walking in the opposite direction. Everyone matched. Cherokee accounts? These weren't hauntings.
They were responses.
Here's the terrifying truth. The Cherokee warnings about forbidden peaks weren't primitive superstitions or cultural metaphors. They were practical survival information based on centuries of documented encounters with entities that maintain active territorial control over specific mountain locations. And we have no system for dealing with them. These aren't ghosts. These are ancient intelligences who manipulate reality like we arrange furniture. They don't haunt us, they correct us. Fold us out of existence when we violate rules we can't perceive. The Cherokee learned to coexist through avoidance and respectful acknowledgement. Modern hikers? We barge in with REI packs and GoPros laughing about spooky peaks. The question isn't whether we believe them. The question is whether we'll survive our ignorance. Because those peaks still remember and they're watching. Story number 6. Some hikers vanish without a trace. Others are found with journals full of impossible landscapes and ghost-like beings. But I found what no one else has, the place they never left. I wasn't chasing myths, I was chasing my missing brother. What I discovered was a civilization outside of time, still inhabited. But by whom? I couldn't say. There are places on Earth where maps fail you, compasses lie, and the sun neither rises nor sets. I walked into one. I never walked out. A stone circle in the woods whispered my name in perfect English, not through sound, but directly into my mind. They promised me refuge. They offered me eternity. They never mentioned the price. I could never leave. I first saw the word Croatan carved into a moss-covered stone deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'd seen pictures in textbooks. Sure, but nothing like this. This wasn't the carving left on the tree at Roanoke Island. This was deeper inland, too inland. My brother Mark had disappeared 2 years ago along the Appalachian Trail. No remains, no gear, not even a disturbed campsite. Just gone. And I didn't believe in ghosts or ancient conspiracies, but I believed in patterns. And the stories I kept reading about lights, about time distortion, about people seeing themselves years younger in reflections. They all began where I stood now. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I was chasing echoes that didn't follow the rules of sound. In the remote town of Valecroft, North Carolina, I found Dr. Amanda Reeves, a reclusive archaeologist. She had been quietly researching a series of undocumented stone formations for over a decade. She showed me satellite scans of 17 stone circles, arranged in a geometric pattern so precise it couldn't be natural. These weren't made by natives or colonists, she said. They were made by something that understood geometry on a cosmic level. Carved into the stones were markings, including the word Croatan, she added, almost whispering. What caught my attention wasn't just the symbols, it was the date stamped on one of the carbon-dated mortar samples between 1587 and 1592, same window when the Roanoke settlers disappeared. The path to the first circle wasn't marked, but it followed a stretch of animal trail that made my compass spin like it was drunk. The air felt thick, charged, like before a storm, but there were no clouds, no wind, just tension. That's when I saw the lights. They didn't blink, they didn't flicker. They hovered low and moved with intelligence. We followed the lights into the mountains, Eleanor Dare had written. They promised peace, food, warmth, everything the coast could not offer. I found the journal sealed in a copper canister beneath one of the stone altars. The ink hadn't faded. The pages weren't damp. It should have crumbled to dust, but it felt freshly written. Eleanor's entries weren't the diary of a young colonial girl. They were the travel log of someone slipping into another world. The lights moved slowly, enticingly, never too fast to scare you. And then the voices came, not spoken words, but implanted thoughts. They said, "We know your pain. Come and rest." I passed through 3 circles over 2 days. Each one had remnants. Personal belongings were left behind in perfect preservation, pewter dishes still arranged on stone tables, clothing stored in wooden chests. I found a teacup with monogrammed initials still resting on a slab table, and I found my brother's red nylon tent set up exactly as he would. The zipper undone, water canteen full, but no one inside. The sun never fully rose again after the 3rd circle. I couldn't tell if it was dawn or dusk. My watch had stopped at 3:12 a.m. The date blinked and reset to 1591. They call it the final settlement. Not because it was the last, it's because no one leaves from there. I found it deep in a hidden valley surrounded by ridges that didn't match any topographic data. GPS failed. My phone battery, which had been at 80%, drained in 5 minutes, but I didn't need tech to know something was wrong. The buildings were pristine, not ruined, built from stone and timber, matching sketches from colonial plans, complete with cleared farmland, fresh water sources, and storage facilities filled with preserved food. I recognized herbs that should have died in frost decades ago. They were fresh, vibrant. The other hikers were here too, not alive, but not gone either. I saw their gear, their journals, photos still in their waterproof bags, but no one remained. And the lights, they circled the valley like guardians, and then they came to me, tall figures, glowing faintly, faces blurred but calm. They projected serenity. They said I had arrived. At first, I believed them, but the food tasted better than anything I'd ever eaten. The water was cold and sweet. I slept for hours without dreams. But after a week, I noticed things. My clothes looked brand new each morning. The seeds I planted had sprouted overnight. My voice echoed strangely, even in open air. And the worst part, my reflection showed me 21. I'm 37. She writes of attempted departures that led them in circles back to the settlement, or I tried the same. I mapped my steps, marked trees, left notes for myself, but every time I reached the third ridge, I emerged again by the stone fountain in the center of the village, a perfect loop. The beings never stopped me. They just watched, not malevolently, but with the sad kindness of a warden watching a prisoner come to terms with life inside. Reeves later found my note stashed under the altar stone. She believed I had vanished like the others, but I was still there, just unreachable. My final attempt was northbound, through the frozen creek. I walked until my legs bled, until frostbite set in, until the valley emerged again, soft and glowing like a fever dream.
I didn't fight anymore.
Leilana's clothing and personal effects showed evidence of ongoing maintenance and repair, as did mine. Someone or something wanted us to remain presentable, preserved. Dr. Reeves never stopped. She continued her research, tracing the 17 known circles with ground-penetrating radar. What she found were tunnels, miles of them, carved, reinforced, and clearly inhabited. In one chamber she found Ellen Adair, preserved, hair brushed, dress mended. In another, she found a GoPro. It contained 10 minutes of footage, static. A man's voice saying, "The sun doesn't move here," then nothing. She compared modern disappearances with Eleanor's journal. The same light, the same voices, the same loss of self. These subterranean passages contain evidence of ongoing occupation, including fresh air circulation, maintained pathways, and storage areas that show signs of recent use. Who maintains them? Who repairs the clothes? Who keeps us clean? You see, the beings aren't collecting artifacts, they're collecting people, like a museum display of the lost. And the worst part,
They make you feel grateful.
not all chambers are empty. I learned this when I followed a tunnel deeper beneath the final settlement, where the air turned sweet, metallic, and slightly warm. Unnaturally so for a mountain hollow, but I followed that warmth like a moth, and then I saw them. Not the luminous guides. These were different. They looked like us, mostly. Some were clothed in colonial garb. Others wore modern fleece and hiking boots. They sat in wide stone alcoves, motionless, but upright, each in their own individual cavity, like books on a shelf. They were breathing, mouths barely open, chests rising and falling like tides on tranquil water, but their eyes were closed. No reaction when I whispered, no twitch when I waved. Response to my touch. Each one had a slate tablet resting beside them. On it, carved in perfect lines, were fragments of thought. I heard the voice of my mother, though she has been dead 10 years. I forgot my name, but I remember planting lavender. The sun is inside me now. It dawned on me, this was not a tomb. It was an archive of memory, of people still alive, yet no longer present. The final settlement wasn't just a refuge or a prison. It was a repository, a library made not of books, but of souls. The beings hadn't imprisoned them. They had curated them.
Some part of me wanted to sit down. Just surrender. Let them place my thoughts on a slab. Let them keep me like they kept Eleanor, like they kept Mark.
But then I saw something that shattered that notion myself. Further down the line of alcoves, I found another version of me, younger, mouth slightly parted, breathing, a tablet beside him that read, "I should not have returned."
I ran, not because I feared death, but because I finally understood what kind of trap this was.
You see, the settlement doesn't age, the food doesn't rot, the people don't die. The angels of the wilderness maintain us not out of kindness, but out of obligation. They are keepers, curators of a museum that no one ever visits, but I think they were once human too, or at least close enough to understand us, and their forms shift, but they always mimic familiarity. They project comfort. They want you to believe this is your choice.
But there is no choice.
Reeves later found underground records that shouldn't have existed. They weren't stone or paper. They were imprinted into a crystalline matrix, somehow alive. When she placed her hand on one, a surge of thought entered her mind. We preserve what time forgets. They aren't predators. They aren't demons. They are conservationists of human potential. They see our collapse, our chaos, our entropy, and they want to freeze our best moments in amber salad. Not out of love, out of obsession. And they do this by deception, a hiker seeking solitude, a settler seeking salvation, each led by familiar lights, drawn deeper into curated peace, each caught in a perfect tableau, never growing, never leaving. Mark didn't vanish. He was collected. The last image I saw before the tunnel folded back into the glowing forest was of Eleanor's face, eyes open now, and smiling faintly, not with joy, but with understanding. I made it to the tree line, but only because I made a choice they hadn't accounted for.
I didn't want eternity. I wanted truth.
Story number 7. I've walked the Appalachian Trail for over 30 years, but I only discovered its true nature when I went below it. There are no warnings, no fences, no signs, but deep beneath the dirt, something ancient waits and watches. The first time I saw the smooth, concrete-like tunnel vanish into the blackness, I knew I had found something not meant to be found. Some people vanish in these woods. Not all of them are lost. Some are claimed. We thought we were the only civilization on this continent. We were wrong. I had seen 1,000 underground caverns, but this one was different. Perfect lines, precision engineering, not of this world, or at least not of this era. Beneath the familiar trails and scenic overlooks of the Appalachian Mountains lies a vast network of caves and tunnels that doesn't appear on any geological survey or speleological map. These aren't natural limestone caverns carved by millennia of water erosion, nor are they abandoned mining operations from America's industrial past. Instead, they represent an artificial underground system that spans the entire length of the Appalachian Trail, connecting distant locations through passages that demonstrate engineering capabilities far beyond anything documented in the historical record of human habitation in these mountains. I stumbled on it in Shenandoah, near Skyland, a part of the trail where I had walked hundreds of times. The day started normal. Cold coffee, damp boots, notes in a leather-bound survey log. I was scanning a slope for rock instability when my equipment flatlined, then rebooted with a reading I had never seen before. A hollow cavity, 40 feet beneath my feet, cutting through the mountain like a needle. I assumed a glitch, ran it twice more, same result. I couldn't shake the feeling of deliberate design. No natural formation runs in a perfect straight line for over 3 miles. No miner would have had the resources to build something like this and leave no trace behind. I filed a request. To dig, to drill. No red flags came back. Oddly, I had clearance within a week. The drill cut through 5 feet of shale, then hit something that wasn't rock. It was too smooth. The core sample pulled up something like concrete, but denser, with flecks of mica and metal too uniform to be accidental. It didn't match anything in the geological database. Carbon dating of organic materials embedded in the lining produced results that predated European colonization by centuries, suggesting the tunnels were constructed long before any documented human engineering projects in the Appalachians. We dropped a camera. What it saw made my assistant drop his laptop. The tunnel extended beyond the range of his lighting equipment in both directions, featuring perfectly smooth walls, a level floor, and architectural details that suggested sophisticated planning and execution. Most disturbing was the evidence of recent use. It wasn't empty. It had been used recently. There were bracket marks along the walls, some with the residue of old torches or lanterns, others with fresh scratches as if something metallic had been mounted and removed. We expanded our scans. What we found was staggering. The tunnel followed the Appalachian Trail like a shadow, extending through multiple states, veering precisely to intersect every major wilderness point. The tunnel system extended far beyond Thompson's initial discovery site. Using remote sensing equipment, his team mapped an underground network that connected locations across multiple states.
But then the movement began.
We left motion sensors near the breach. Within 3 nights, they detected coordinated movement, always between midnight and sunrise. No wildlife moved in linear patrols. No animal opened and closed the hidden entrance panel with surgical precision. Whatever was inside knew the system well and knew we were watching. We weren't the first to discover the tunnels. We were just the first to survive. Deep in a side corridor, behind what looked like a collapsed chamber, we found the archive. Rows of carefully preserved gear, backpacks from the 1970s, canteens, shoes, journals, each tagged and labeled like museum artifacts, some with names that matched missing persons reports along the Appalachian for over 5 decades, and journals, handwritten, some lucid, some descending into madness. The captive hikers described structured communities with defined social hierarchies, specialized work assignments, and cultural practices that blended elements from multiple historical periods and geographical regions. Most disturbing was their gradual acceptance of underground life.
They were being indoctrinated, conditioned, made to forget the surface.
I turned the last page of one journal. The hiker had stopped trying to escape. He had started calling the tunnels home. The surveillance evidence included detailed maps of the surface trail system with notations in unknown languages, photographic documentation of individual hikers, and what appeared to be behavioral analysis charts tracking human movement patterns and camping preferences. We were being watched, long before we ever found them. Somewhere beneath the peaks and forest floors, someone, something, was tracking hikers, studying them, documenting their behavior like scientists observing primates in a jungle.
But for what purpose?
Then one night, the camera caught something.
A figure, humanoid, pale, watching us from the edge of the light, motionless. It didn't blink. It didn't move like a man. And then it vanished.
We sealed the breach. We left no markers. Not because we feared being stopped, but because we feared being followed.
I still dream of the maps, of the faces in the journals, of the eyes that stared from the dark.
But I dream most of the question that remains. What are they waiting for? Because they've been watching us for centuries.
And they are still waiting.
We thought the tunnel systems were only occupied by adults, people taken, perhaps converted, like the journal writers, but we were wrong. In the farthest chamber we had ever accessed, 3 miles off the main line, we found carvings unlike the others. Not symbols, but murals, figures of small children holding hands, faces blank. One figure held a lantern, the others held nothing. At the chamber's center sat a stone cradle. It looked ancient, but undisturbed. No dust, no cobwebs. Inside it, we found a set of clothing, child-sized, handmade, with fibers that didn't register on any material database. Beside it, a doll carved from a single piece of bone, with no facial features, only holes where the eyes should be. Under the cradle, a phrase etched in 3 different scripts, Latin, Algonquian, and something we couldn't identify. The Latin read, chosen before they walk.
That night we heard it, a voice, high, like a child's, humming a slow tune. The acoustics of the tunnel made it impossible to locate the source, but every recording device we placed captured it. Always the same melody, and always between 3 and 3:15 in the morning.
And always, from within the sealed chamber, the journals began making more sense. They weren't linear. They were written across timelines. One hiker wrote for over 40 years, based on internal clues, yet when his disappearance was reported, it had only been a week since he'd last checked in at a trail station. The tunnels distort time. One researcher ran a controlled test, placed 2 synchronized watches in separate chambers. After 3 days, they differed by 17 minutes. On day 5, one of them reversed time by 23 seconds, then corrected itself. About more than physical isolation, the network operated on different temporal mechanics, and the ones who built it knew how to use it. That explains why no one ever escapes. Not because they're trapped, but because by the time they climb out, the world they knew is gone. Cheung Chin, the descent. Our last descent was unauthorized. We bypassed Park Service oversight and re-entered near Roan Mountain. The tunnel was colder than before, drier, as though something massive had shifted within the system. 2 miles in, we encountered a patrol. Humanoid figures, uniform steps, no lights, yet they moved with precision. We hid behind a breach in the wall and watched them pass. Their skin was greyish, stretched thin, their eyes, when they turned toward us, reflected like wet stone. They carried no weapons, but in their silence, there was an unmistakable command. This place was theirs. After they vanished, we pressed deeper. The tunnel ceiling grew lower, the walls more refined. No tool marks now. Everything felt grown rather than carved, alive. We reached a hall. At its center stood a single obsidian obelisk with the trail map etched across it, and markers that pulsed faintly along its length. Each pulse corresponded to a living hiker. They weren't just watching us, they were tracking us in real time. Story number 8. They told me the mountains were empty, that what stood abandoned stayed that way. But they were wrong, so terribly wrong. I wasn't just followed through the woods. I was studied, monitored like a rat in a maze, watched by eyes that didn't blink, hidden behind shattered windows and rotting walls. I didn't come here chasing ghosts or monsters. I came for the silence, the ruins, the history left behind. What I found instead was an intelligence cloaked in rot, and it had been expecting me. Every time I lifted my camera, I caught something not quite there. A glint where no sunlight reached. Movement too fluid, too intentional to be animal. Tried to explain it away, until the first time it moved my equipment.
There's a kind of fear that goes beyond being hunted. No, it's the terror of knowing you've been catalogued, filed, and perhaps selected.
I was alone. That's how I liked it. Hiking the Appalachian backroads, lens in hand, searching for the forgotten places where civilization had once clawed at the wild. The cabins, sagging and weathered, with their broken windows and mossy roofs, whispered stories I longed to preserve. One cabin stood nearly 2 miles off the main trail, tucked deep behind bramble and silence. I reached it by feel, intuition guiding me through a logging path that no longer existed on maps. Its log walls were hand-hewn, and the stone chimney had long cooled, or so I assumed. I took the shots I always took, wide angles, detail frames of moss on floorboards, the way vines had crept through nail holes. That evening, reviewing images at my camp, I noticed something I couldn't explain. In at least 5 frames, the same window, broken, unglassed, held a faint white distortion, a shape, and in every frame, it was positioned identically, as though waiting. I returned the next morning with more gear, infrared sensors, motion triggers. I wasn't ghost hunting. I just wanted to know what the hell I'd seen. Inside, the illusion shattered. The floorboards weren't rotting, they were swept. Footprints, ash in the hearth, furniture arranged with uncanny care. I froze at the top of the ladder leading to the loft. The bedding there, clean, folded, recently used. Something was living here. That night, I left a thermal camera recording from a crawl space. What it captured changed everything. The figure wasn't solid, sometimes, but it resembled a man, tall, with long arms and fluid gait. Sometimes it was a flicker, like heat shimmer on pavement. It never walked toward the lens, only around it, always just outside, full focus, always aware. What I discovered wasn't a one-off. I began checking other cabins, 17 in total across 50 miles of trail. In each, I found the same contradiction: decay on the outside, preservation within, and movement, always movement. I started mapping them, noting patterns in maintenance. One cabin would show fresh ash on Mondays, another would have swept floors by Thursday. They weren't abandoned, they were occupied on rotation. In time, I realized I was being watched, but not just occasionally, but constantly, not just by one entity. A system, a network. Around campsites, I began finding stones arranged in odd but deliberate patterns. At first, I thought it coincidence, but then my tent zipper jammed from the outside, subtly, as though sabotaged. Motion sensors began malfunctioning. SD cards wiped themselves. I never saw them directly, but between only what they did. Cameras turned to face walls, batteries drained in moments, images overexposed or full of strange light halos that seemed purposeful. I found one cabin filled with organized displays of human gear, jackets, flashlights, notebooks, not stolen, collected, studied. One pair of binoculars had been taken apart and reassembled incorrectly, like a child mimicking understanding, except the layout was better, lighter, more efficient. I knew then I wasn't dealing with spirits. This was intelligence, curious, organized, adaptive intelligence. It happened at dusk. I approached the last cabin I dared to document. I'd spotted fresh scrape marks on the threshold earlier that week, signs of repeated use. I set up near the front window, not expecting what came next. The thing behind the glass didn't hide. It stood there, straight-backed, limbs too long, neck tilted like a bird, studying something new. Me. Its eyes reflected the dying light in a way no humans could. Not red, not gold. A kind of mirror sheen that seemed to drink in the world around it. And I swear it was so, as I fumbled for my camera, it smirked. There was no aggression, no movement to frighten me off. Only stillness, deliberate stillness. Like it had been waiting to be seen. For 30 full seconds, we watched each other. Then it stepped backward, vanished into the dark. I didn't chase it. I didn't need to. When I returned to camp, I found my fire pit rearranged, my map gone. In its place, a hand-carved stick figure tied with vines. It wore my missing scarf. I packed up the next morning and left the trail for good. They hadn't harmed me, but they had learned enough. And I had learned too much. Story number 9. You'd think 2 decades of hiking the Appalachian would grant you some authority over its moods, but that's the thing about this trail. It remembers every step, but offers no loyalty in return. I'd been walking that same 20-mile stretch near the Nantahala Gorge for most of my adult life, volunteering, painting blazes, clearing brush, checking for deadfall after storms, same rhythm, same trees, same markers, until they started vanishing, not fading, disappearing. The first time, I thought it was my memory playing tricks. I distinctly remembered repainting a blaze on a bent ash tree beside the fork to Lost Widow's Ridge. Yet when I returned 6 months later, nothing. No paint, no residue, no sign the bark had ever been touched, clean as a virgin log. I chalked it up to vandals. Happens more than you'd think. But when it kept happening, and only at critical junctions, I started documenting. Every 50 to 100 feet, these white blazes appear, painted meticulously by volunteers who understand that misdirection can be deadly. That's when I saw the pattern, not random, not malicious teenagers. No, something was playing a deeper game. It's hard to explain the particular dread that settles in when you're lost somewhere you've never been, and it still feels familiar. I interviewed some of the lost, folks who swore they followed white blazes deep into areas that shouldn't have had any. A family man from Pennsylvania, hiking alone for the weekend, told me he followed one blaze to a rock overhang and suddenly found himself in a dry basin with no trail in sight. Another woman said she remembered a marker glowing faintly before fading entirely. Most unsettling were reports from experienced hikers who claimed to have seen white blazes that led them off the correct trail, only to discover later that no official markers existed in those locations. These phantom blazes didn't just mislead, they selected the unprepared, the overconfident, the solo. I started to feel watched myself, not by eyes, but by terrain. Paths shifted when I blinked. Familiar junctions bent at wrong angles. I'd check GPS against compass and still feel disoriented. Sometimes it felt like the forest wanted me lost. I tried repainting a few of the disappeared blazes. That's when the trees started spitting them back out. The bark wouldn't hold the paint. I'd come back the next day, and it would be gone, so completely that you'd think I dreamed the entire act of painting it. Volunteer maintainers found that fresh paint applied to previously affected trees would fade or disappear within days regardless of weather conditions or paint quality. I sent samples to a lab upstate. A biochemist named Torres took an interest. What he found was impossible: organic compounds inside the bark that prevented chemical adhesion. Something was neutralizing human interaction at the molecular level. Worse, the effect was spreading. Trees in surrounding areas began showing the same resistance, like it was contagious. I set up trail cams, thought I'd catch some smug eco-vandal with a scraping tool. What I saw was worse. Nothing, no people, no animals, just change. One frame, the blaze is there. Next frame, it's gone. And in between, distortions, shivering air, flickers in the foliage, a sense that time hiccuped and forgot to tell the trees. Motion-activated cameras positioned near vulnerable markers detected activity during the hours when blazes disappeared, but the recorded footage showed environmental disturbances rather than identifiable agents of removal. A ranger suggested wind, maybe condensation, but that doesn't explain the electromagnetic interference that fried two of my cameras, or why the temperature dropped 10 degrees within a 50-foot radius when the markers vanished. The real horror came when we followed the false markers ourselves. Dr. Chen, a psychologist from Vermont, joined me for one last hike. She'd been studying how confusion alters cognition in wilderness survival scenarios. We entered a section near Fontana Dam, where 4 hikers had gone missing in 6 weeks. She noticed it first, a fresh white blaze on a rock wall, high up and perfectly aligned with the descending ridge. It shouldn't have been there, but it was too precise to ignore. So we followed. The trail narrowed, brush thickened. Blazes led us down a ravine not marked on any map. For miles, no sounds, not even birds. Eventually, the blazes stopped. Just void. We turned back. At least we thought we did. The markers had vanished behind us. The terrain rearranged, and that's when I realized. It's not that the trail is unmarked, it's that something doesn't want you found. Kim's records revealed something that transformed routine maintenance concerns into evidence of systematic sabotage targeting the trail's navigation infrastructure. We took months remapping areas, and in doing so, an unnerving schema unfolded. The vanishing blazes clustered around stream crossings, trail forks, and disused logging roads, exactly where hikers needed certainty. Like someone studied our minds, our tendencies under stress, and laid snares precisely where doubt blooms. Chen called it environmental gaslighting. Strip just enough context from a person's surroundings and their entire perception collapses. According to Chen's research, the systematic removal of trailblazers created a form of environmental gaslighting that undermined hikers' confidence in their navigation abilities. Search and rescue started noticing correlations. Disappearances within 30 days of blaze removals, always solo, always in decent weather, always with enough supplies to survive, on paper. Analysis of search and rescue data revealed that hikers disappeared most frequently in areas where marker removal had been documented within the previous 30 days. But they didn't die of exposure or injury, they were simply gone. Chen proposed the markers were acting as psychological bait, appearing only when someone's mind was ripe for misdirection. I had a different theory. What if the blazes weren't markers anymore? What if they were invitations? I began cross-referencing maintenance logs from other states, similar anomalies in Pennsylvania, Maine, Tennessee, hundreds of miles apart, yet the same signature, vanished blazes at key junctions, strange chemical signatures, electronics malfunctioning. It wasn't isolated. The removals followed seasonal patterns that correlated with peak hiking periods, concentrating during times when the maximum number of people would be affected by navigational disruption. I sent a report to the National Park Service. No response. I wasn't surprised. The trail changed for me after that. It felt aware, like each step I took was part of something else's plan. One evening, I saw a new blaze, small, deliberate, on a fallen log that shouldn't have held any. I ignored it. But later, while descending a familiar ridge, I saw the same blaze again, freshly painted, this time on stone.
That's when I knew it had marked me back.
There are places now where no blazes stick. We call them dead zones. Paint vanishes in hours. GPS glitches. Phones die. The affected areas were gradually expanding, creating growing sections of trail where permanent marking became impossible to maintain. New hikers don't notice, but those of us who've mapped these woods for decades know these zones are not forgotten.
They're claimed.
The disappearing trail markers represent something far more sinister than environmental vandalism or natural marker degradation. They demonstrate organized intervention in the Appalachian Trail's navigation infrastructure, designed to create controlled opportunities for hiker disappearance while maintaining the appearance of natural or accidental circumstances. If you ever find yourself on a lonely stretch of the trail and a white blaze appears where none should be, turn around. Don't follow it, because whatever paints those phantom blazes isn't trying to help you. It's hunting. Story number 10. I was trained to recognize hoaxes. We all were. But when the call came in from 8 miles deep inside Shenandoah's no-signal zone, clear voice, perfect coordinates, I stopped breathing. He said his name was Marcus. Calm, lucid, described a bridge that never existed, lights from buildings no map had marked. Then he vanished. We kept hearing from him weeks later, same GPS pin, same dead zone, each time clearer, more desperate, and each time no one was there. These weren't isolated, dispatchers across 4 states started getting calls from the same people at the same time, miles apart. One caller warned of an accident 2 days before it happened. Same location, same details. What kind of helpline gets distress calls from the future? I've worked over 1,000 wilderness calls. Most are heat stroke, wrong turns, bad luck. But nothing prepared me for the voice that rang through the Shenandoah dispatch line that night. I had just finished logging a midnight false alarm about a black bear sighting when the line lit up again. Routine. I sipped what passed for coffee and answered, 911, what's your emergency? A pause, then a man's voice, smooth and steady. My name's Marcus Chen. I'm lost. I don't know where I am, but I've followed the trail. I need help. Are you injured, sir? No, he replied. Just confused. Things look different out here. Different how? I didn't even get the chance to ask, because then the GPS location stamped across my screen stopped me cold. It placed him nearly 8 miles into Shenandoah National Park, an area with 0 cell reception according to every coverage map we had. No towers, no satellite alignment, just dense terrain and dead silence. And yet, his voice was crystal clear. There's a stone bridge to our, he continued, over a deep ravine. I can see lights in the distance, some sort of building.
That made no sense. That sector of the park had no infrastructure, No trails, no footpaths.
I logged every word, patched in the county's SAR team, and stayed on the line with Marcus for 23 minutes. He spoke calmly, but with occasional lapses with DAing. He'd correct himself and say he had a compass, then ask if he'd brought one, said he was hiking solo, then mentioned someone walking beside him. 2 hours later, our team reached the coordinates. Dense brush, steep incline, no evidence of a human footprint, no Marcus, no bridge, and no light.
And no signal.
Rescue teams couldn't even reach dispatch by radio. Marcus wasn't a fluke. Over the next 6 months, we began documenting similar cases, calls that shouldn't exist, from people who shouldn't be reachable. Each one came in during the late hours, always from solo hikers, all experienced, well-equipped, rational, yet each described completely foreign landmarks, rivers that ran the wrong way, trees forming near-perfect spirals, paths turning to glass. We compiled over 40 calls. In almost every case, search teams found nothing, no gear, no footprints, not even disturbed foliage, and never any cell service. What unsettled us more were the follow-ups. Some of the missing hikers called back days, weeks, even months after they'd officially vanished. They used the same phones, same voices, same exact GPS coordinates, as if time hadn't passed for them.
But it had.
One woman, Rebecca L., called 911 from a dead zone in Tennessee 2 months after vanishing. Her family had buried an empty casket. In her call, she referenced the funeral to how could she have known? We brought in Amanda Rivera, a telecommunications engineer from Deep Sea. She tore apart our recordings, analyzed signal logs, and cross-referenced satellite alignments. Her conclusion was stunning. These calls aren't coming through the cellular grid, she said. They're piggybacking onto emergency networks, but the signal source doesn't align with any tower, satellite, or mesh. So what were we hearing? Possibly satellite transmissions from tech that doesn't exist publicly, possibly something else. Rivera pointed out signal anomalies, modulations consistent with high-altitude bounce patterns, except the timing made that physically impossible. Even stranger, some calls were being received simultaneously by emergency centers across multiple states, same timestamp, same voice, same coordinates. I asked her how a human could exist in multiple places at once. She didn't answer. We revisited every call. A behavioral analyst joined us. Her conclusion? These weren't deranged ramblers. Their panic, confusion, and logic were consistent with trauma, not deception. What stood out most were memory lapses. Callers forgot their names or said different ones. One man claimed to be 31, then corrected himself to 42. Another said his GPS showed a river when none existed, then said, sorry, maybe that was last time. Callers also mentioned companions who weren't real. I was with my brother. He just went ahead, said one. He was an only child. Another claimed to be sheltering in a ranger cabin. We checked. That cabin had burned down in 1993.
They weren't making this up.
The most chilling accounts weren't the initial calls, but what came later. Callers spoke of being kept safe by camps they didn't build, food that appeared ready-made, cabins with clean water and dry beds. One described waking up under a tarp strung between trees he didn't recognize. Another said, there was a map in the shelter, but none of the trails match reality.
They weren't hallucinating.
One SAR team swore they saw light reflecting in the valley below, a campfire or lantern. When they arrived, nothing was there. It was as if the hikers existed in some fold of terrain adjacent to ours, just one step out of reach. Then came the predictive calls. A hiker named Julian described a broken leg, twisted on the ridge above Trail 6B. Our team arrived in 40 minutes, on nothing. 2 days later, a separate hiker, not related, not connected, broke his leg in that exact spot. Julian's call had described the injury, the timing, and even the make of the other hiker's pack before it happened. These were templates, warnings from people in alternate paths. Then we got the call that referenced a no-fly zone, coordinates restricted to military ops. The caller said, there's a black drone here, no lights, just humming, the trees are vibrating. We later confirmed a classified Air Force exercise in the area, not public knowledge. Who or what was relaying these? Dispatchers began cracking. A few quit, others needed counseling. They said the worst part wasn't the confusion, it was the helplessness. Hearing people suffer in places no one could reach. I kept listening to the Marcus recording. Something felt off. Then it hit me. I followed the trail markers, he'd said, but they changed, bent towards somewhere else. We found other cases with the same sentence, verbatim. These weren't just distress calls, they were entries, markers, signatures from people lost in mirror versions of our wilderness. My theory, there's a seam, a threshold in certain locations where, if conditions align, people pass through, and on the other side, they still try to call home. The emergency calls from impossible locations represent more than technical anomalies or supernatural communication events. They provide evidence that hikers are being displaced into alternate versions of familiar wilderness areas where normal rescue operations cannot reach them. The truth, every one of those calls might be a voice from a place just one step to the left of real. A trail that loops outside time, a signal from the other side. Story number 11. I was warned never to hike alone past Black Ridge, not by people, but by the forest itself. You see, the trail stopped being a trail long before my boots ever touched its soil. There were no signs, no rustling birds, not even the wind dared to pass the trees where I was going, and when I reached the peak that wasn't supposed to exist, the mountain shifted as if it breathed. It wasn't just alive, it was watching. Most maps lie by omission. They tell you where you can go, not where you shouldn't. I was hired under contract, same as always, data anomaly analysis across national parks. They said, what they meant was, we don't know why people vanish, and we want you to make sense of it without making us look bad. And I could have. I should have, until I ran the Appalachian Trail dataset and realized every single outlier, disappearances, electromagnetic flares, reported sightings, temporal anomalies, pointed to a coordinate that didn't exist on any USGS registry. In Neve Gallia, the place where all paths end, that name didn't come from a surveyor or ranger station. It came from an old Cherokee oral record. The only written transcription I could find had been passed down by Elder Joseph Crowfeather, who simply said, if you hear her song, it's too late to choose.
I wish I had listened.
We were a team of 5, me, a field geophysicist, a Cherokee scholar, an ex-Pentagon remote viewing analyst with a and a botanist. We all had our reasons, none of them good enough. Our gear stopped working before we even crossed the Blue Ridge threshold. GPS said we were simultaneously in Tennessee, Virginia, and Quebec. The botanist whispered, that can't be right, but didn't turn back. Every direction we walked, the mountain stayed ahead, not closer, not farther, just ahead. The Cherokee elder said it best. You don't walk to Neve Gallia, it walks you. The statistical probability of such convergence occurring through random chance was virtually zero, suggesting intelligent design behind the positioning of supernatural activity.
Those were my words in the report. I didn't believe them at the time, not really. Now I know the math didn't lie. The mountain wasn't a destination, it was a net.
At night, we didn't sleep, not out of fear, out of awe. Imagine standing under a sky so close you feel its weight pressing against your ribs. That's how it felt near the convergence point. Our EM meters pulsed in waves, syncing with the same rhythm as our heartbeats.
Then came the song.
The whistling woman's song could be heard growing stronger as they approached the coordinates, but serving as an audio beacon guiding the research team toward their destination.
Only it wasn't a whistle anymore. It was a lullaby. Not in English, not in Cherokee. Just familiar.
The remote viewer, Kyle Solm, claimed he remembered hearing it before he was born. The botanist wept uncontrollably for hours after hearing it, and
me, I followed it.
It's hard to describe the impossible, but I'll try. The convergence point wasn't just a peak, it was everywhere. Tropical orchids bloomed beside frost-covered ferns. Water flowed uphill beside rivers, frozen mid-current. My instruments recorded 7 microclimates within a 10-foot radius. We stumbled upon ruins, Stone structures showed construction techniques from different eras arranged in chronological impossibility. A Roman arch rested beside a Cherokee medicine wheel. A Victorian gate melted into a modern fiberglass staircase that led nowhere.
Time doesn't run here, the botanist whispered. It nests. And I swear to you, that mountain moved when no one looked directly at it.
We found them by accident, or maybe they wanted to be found. They weren't ghosts, they weren't creatures, they were people, kind faces, old souls. Some wore settler coats from the 1600s, others dressed in clothes that looked futuristic, metallic, designed for another planet. And all of them looked at us with the same quiet understanding. The location operated as a collection center where people from different time periods and geographical origins were integrated into a hidden civilization. No one asked us to stay, but they didn't have to. 3 of our team did. What chilled me most wasn't the physics, or the memories fading from my brain as I tried to recount them. It was the infrastructure they were building. Construction activities using unknown technologies were creating new infrastructure designed to accommodate vastly increased human populations. We saw glass towers folding into themselves, alive, satellite-like arrays pointed inward, not out. I counted rows of containment chambers below the soil, as if the mountain expected guests, mass guests, And we weren't their first outreach team.
We were their first ambassadors.
We left, or at least I think we did. The elder sacrificed himself to keep the rest of us grounded in our own time, drinking a mixture that burned his veins black, allowing us to sever the tether. But even now, I question, was he real or just part of the mountain's design to let us feel saved? I've tried reporting, I've tried remembering. Every time I describe it, the words slip. Well,
every time I sleep, I hear her song. And someday, when they're ready, they won't need to lure anyone anymore.
The Appalachian Trail isn't a trail, it's a funnel. Story number 12. The air pulsed with attention no excitement should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim road, its hush thrumming with an unseen rhythm. I sat behind the wheel, the asphalt creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Dust, metal, something watchful. Something that clung to my breath. Something that knew my eagerness. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive. Its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to travel, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The pulse deepened, a vibration threading through the air. A sound that wasn't mine. The faint headlights flickered, casting shadows that danced like figures. Their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the gear. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The road wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under the tires, its silence a predator. I carried my anticipation, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the road a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd journeyed here, those who'd never left. And I was no stranger to adventure. But this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. After decades of investigation, hundreds of documented encounters, and countless missing persons cases, The question that haunts every researcher who has delved into the supernatural phenomena of the Appalachian Trail isn't what exists in these ancient mountains. It's why. What purpose drives entities that possess capabilities far beyond human understanding to maintain such elaborate surveillance and collection operations along America's most famous hiking trail? The answer? When glimpsed through the accumulated evidence of 11 interconnected mysteries, reveals a truth more disturbing than any individual supernatural encounter. The Appalachian Trail serves as a testing ground where humanity itself is being evaluated by intelligences that will soon decide our species' ultimate fate. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, former director of the Appalachian Anomalies Research Project, spent 37 years documenting supernatural phenomena along the trail before making the connections that revealed the underlying purpose behind centuries of mysterious activity. Her final report, submitted to an undisclosed federal agency in December 2023, synthesized evidence from every major supernatural investigation conducted since the trail's establishment in 1921. What Morrison discovered through this comprehensive analysis transformed isolated incidents into evidence of a coordinated assessment program designed to evaluate human behavior, capabilities, and potential for evolution or elimination. According to Morrison's findings, the supernatural entities operating throughout the Appalachian Corridor aren't random manifestations of unknown phenomena, but representatives of an intelligence network that has been studying human development for millennia. The Cherokee Nightland beings, the underground tunnel operators, the watchers in abandoned cabins, and every other documented entity serve specialized functions within a vast research operation designed to understand human psychology, social behavior, technological capabilities, and evolutionary potential. The road's pulse was a spark, its whispers a truth that lingered in my eagerness, a truth that followed me to the mystery. The air shivered with a chill no understanding should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim trail, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I walked with my thoughts, the path creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Earth, moss, something probing, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my curiosity. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive. Its breath, a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to questions, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows, or the chill deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint trail markers flickered, casting shadows that danced like eyes, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the map. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The trail wasn't empty, it was full. Brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else. Something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my inquiry, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the trail a canvas of lives, spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd wandered here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to wonder, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. The Whistling Woman's role extends beyond simple predation. She serves as a psychological screening device that identifies individuals with specific mental characteristics that make them valuable research subjects. Her ability to manipulate human emotions and decision-making through auditory stimuli provides data about cognitive vulnerabilities that could be exploited on a species-wide level. Each person who follows her song into the wilderness undergoes evaluation of their susceptibility to supernatural influence, providing information about human mental defense mechanisms and their limitations. The pale crawlers function as biological assessment specialists, studying human physical capabilities and limitations through direct observation and interaction. Their mimicry behavior serves to document human movement patterns, while their territorial activities map human navigation abilities and survival instincts. The intelligence they gather about human physical performance feeds into larger evaluations of our species' adaptive potential and biological resilience under extreme conditions. The time-slip phenomena represent controlled experiments in temporal manipulation designed to test human psychological responses to chronological displacement and reality distortion. The entities conducting these experiments are evaluating whether humans can maintain mental stability when fundamental assumptions about time and causality are violated, gathering data about our cognitive flexibility and adaptation potential for existence in environments where normal physical laws don't apply. Morrison's analysis revealed that the shadow people serve as long-term behavioral monitoring specialists, documenting human social patterns, individual decision-making processes, and group dynamics over extended observation periods. The trail's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my curiosity, a truth that followed me to the study. The air thickened with a strain no peace should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim ridge, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I climbed higher, the rock creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Stone, wind, something testing, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my resolve. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to challenge. But this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The strain deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint ridge light flickered, casting shadows that danced like judgments. Their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the ledge. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The ridge wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my determination, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the ridge a canvas of lives, spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd climbed here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to endurance, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. Their surveillance network generates detailed psychological profiles of human personalities, allowing the intelligence network to predict and potentially control human behavior through targeted interventions that exploit documented individual vulnerabilities. The Cherokee warnings about forbidden peaks weren't primitive superstitions, but accurate intelligence about testing zones where human subjects underwent intensive evaluation under controlled, supernatural conditions. The night land beings used these restricted areas to conduct experiments that would be impossible in normal environments. Studying human responses to reality manipulation, entity contact, and environmental impossibility. The traditional protocols for avoiding these areas represented survival information passed down through generations of tribal encounters with the testing operations. The Lost Colony Connection revealed the historical scope of the intelligence network's human collection and study programs. The Roanoke colonists weren't the victims of random supernatural intervention, but selected subjects transported to long-term research facilities where their adaptation to supernatural environments could be monitored across multiple generations. The stone settlements found throughout the mountains represent field stations where human subjects undergo extended observation while believing they live in hidden refuges rather than research laboratories. The underground network serves as infrastructure for transporting research subjects between testing facilities while maintaining comprehensive surveillance of surface human activity. The ridge's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my resolve, a truth that followed me to the experiment. The air crackled with a dread no safety should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim hollow, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I moved cautiously, the earth creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Mud. Silence. Something assessing, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my fear. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive. Its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to vigilance, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The dread deepened, a vibration threading through the air. A sound that wasn't mine. The faint, hollow light flickered, casting shadows that danced like watchers. Their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the air. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The hollow wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet. Its silence a predator. I carried my caution, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the hollow a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd lingered here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to unease, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. The tunnel systems allow entities to move human subjects without detection while gathering intelligence about surface civilization through observation points that provide complete coverage of the Appalachian Trail corridor. The collected hiking equipment and personal belongings represent archived samples of human technology and culture studied to understand our species' development trajectory. Morrison's investigation of the Watchers in abandoned cabins revealed their function as human behavior analysis specialists who study our responses to isolation, abandonment, and supernatural observation. The entities occupying these structures monitor how humans react to persistent surveillance, documenting psychological breaking points and adaptation strategies that provide information about mental resilience and social dependency patterns. The disappearing trail markers represent controlled experiments in navigation disruption designed to test human problem-solving abilities under conditions of systematic misdirection and environmental manipulation. The false blazes that replace legitimate markers serve to evaluate how humans respond to deceptive information. The hollow's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my fear, a truth that followed me to the observation. The air faded with a silence no hope should endure, its currents weaving secrets through the dim summit, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood at the peak, the stone creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Wind, dread, something final, something that clung to my soul, something that knew my fate. The space stretched with its edges bending as if the night was alive. Its breath, a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to reflection, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The silence deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint summit light flickered, casting shadows that danced like judgments. Their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the rock. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The summit wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I glanced back, the space stretching behind, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my mind, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my uncertainty, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze vanished. The summit, a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd stood here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to destiny, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. The emergency calls from impossible locations function as communication experiments that test human responses to technological impossibility and rescue system failure. The entities conducting these tests are evaluating how humans react when fundamental assumptions about technology and safety systems are violated, gathering information about panic responses, decision-making under extreme stress, and adaptation to circumstances that challenge basic understanding of reality. The convergence point serves as the central headquarters where all collected data is analyzed and evaluated by the intelligence network's leadership. Morrison's research suggested that this location operates as a decision-making center where the accumulated information about human capabilities and limitations is being used to determine whether our species meets criteria for continued existence or requires intervention to prevent potential threats to larger cosmic systems. Morrison's final analysis revealed that the supernatural phenomena along the Appalachian Trail represent the concluding phase of a comprehensive species evaluation that has been ongoing for centuries. The intelligence network has been systematically documenting human behavior, psychology, technology, and evolutionary potential to determine whether we possess the wisdom and restraint necessary for advanced development or whether we represent a threat that requires containment or elimination. The summit's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my fate. a truth that followed me to the verdict.